gathering. And the reason for that is that more often than not, education technologies are there to accelerate what is currently happening at universities. And that, unfortunately, doesn't produce particularly good results. So much of the energy around higher education all over the world centers on addressing three symptoms of problems. The first symptom is the concept of access to higher education. We want more and more people to be able to access higher education offerings. The second is the concept of completion. Once they access that education, there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that students actually complete and get their degrees. And the third is about reducing the costs of delivery of higher education, a sector that has been infamous in its challenges of cost, whether those costs are borne through tuition payments by the learner or their parents, whether they're borne by governments, by other subsidies of various kinds, etc. And these three goals, broadly, are ones where government policies, philanthropies, new institutions that are starting up, institutions that are expanding, and yes, the education technology sector have been dramatically focused on over the past 30 plus years, in many senses in the past 50 years. And so, oftentimes we can look at some of the results and feel pretty good. Yes, costs of higher education writ large continue to grow. Yes, there are all sorts of other critiques of higher education that are happening all over the world, but some of the headline numbers, more people are accessing higher education in greater and greater numbers, are about 10 million new learners in higher education in a given year than there were in the previous year. Now, of course, it was set off a little bit by COVID, in which was a downward lift, a significant downward lift in that, but overall, those elements, and completion rates seem to be going up. But unfortunately, if you look at the underlying elements of why this is occurring, the news isn't particularly good. Earlier this year, there was a study around why is it that graduation rates in the United States have risen dramatically over the last 30 years, since 1990. The answer was that 100% of the variance, in fact more than 100%, was due to one factor. That was grade inflation. Basically, outcomes for students that 30 years ago would be considered unacceptable to certify learning now have become highly acceptable. You may have seen the news around an NYU professor who was actually a Princeton professor for many, many years, in his 80s, wrote the primary book on organic chemistry and offered a class in organic chemistry at NYU last semester, and had a number of students get 0 correct answers, nothing correct on the exam. The students complained, what happened? He got fired. Because there is a silver bullet that enables universities to increase access, that enables those that access universities to finish those universities, and doesn't cost a lot of money, and that's the lower standards. And that silver bullet has been fired by higher education institutions all over the world, over and over and over again. It's a disease that has crept into high school education, and it is a world in which we have come to accept, and I say we, I mean broad society, that really the role of higher education isn't to educate, it's to certify. It is a diploma mill. And it doesn't matter if that diploma mill is Harvard University or the University of Phoenix. The assumption is that if university, sometimes you may want to cram for a test, even though that's not necessary anymore. You pass that test because you can't flunk it anymore, and then the day after you forget everything that was on the test. If you doubt that, imagine that these pieces of paper you have in front of you on the back, don't worry, it's not there, there's a final exam that you got an A on during your college career. And you were to turn it over and I would start timing you and say, take that test. Do you think any of you would be able to get anything above an F on that test today? Pick your subject. Unless you become a professor of that subject later on in your life, you will all flunk that test unless you have an aberrant intellectual capacity. But the majority learner in any institution, from the most selective to the least, has practically no ability to retain what they've learned in a university setting. In fact, when I started Minerva, and I talked about the curricular innovation behind Minerva, and I talked about it over and over and over again. I spent maybe 45 to 65% of the time talking just about the curriculum. And I was talking to graduates of all Ivy League universities, of Stanford or Chicago, and they would look at me during the pitch with increasingly puzzled looks on their faces. And they said, "But we don't understand. You want to build this great university where students get to travel and live all over the world, and you keep talking about what happens in the classroom. Everyone knows you can't learn anything in class." And they couldn't even fathom that class could be useful. Because when they think about their day-to-day, I bet if you think about your day-to-day, if you think about what you do, the decisions you have to make, the problems you encounter, I guarantee you that the vast majority of the tools that you deploy to deal with those issues, those problems, those questions, were not ones you learned in college. Certainly not in the college classroom. And so, what does this have to do with the future of higher education? Am I saying that higher education will continue to deteriorate in quality, that it will continue to become less and less meaningful, that faith in higher education institutions will continue to plummet? Well, that may be a scenario. It may be in our future. But if it is, this entire sector, at least as it is constituted today, will cease to exist. At some point, governments, parents, other institutions are going to say, time out. Why are we spending this kind of money on this type of sector if we aren't getting demonstrable value, demonstrable return? And COVID was, I believe, an exceptional inflection point for the sector. Not because COVID changed everything about higher education, not because what higher education institutions needed to do, which is to deploy some technology in order to deliver their classes, is any kind of model that anybody wants to use in the future. It is instead because COVID was an emperor has no clothes moment. Most of us, I imagine, perhaps all of us, think of college very fondly. We think about what a great time we had in college. But we had a great time in college despite class, not because of it. We don't think back at college and say, oh my God, the revelatory nature of what I've learned, the things that I keep with me throughout my entire life's journey. Those are the things that make me nostalgic. Those are the things I want to go back to. No. We think about friends, we think about maturation, we think about being away from home, we think about parties, we think about pursuing those other individuals who we're interested in spending more quality time with. These are the things that we grab onto. but we conflate them by thinking, wait, there was a certification involved with that, and it was important to get that certification to be able to be successful later on in life. And so we forget how much we thought that class was a waste of time. We forget how little practical value it had for us. But COVID reminded us parents. It beamed into hundreds of millions of living rooms around the world the core rot of what classroom education is like, from primary, secondary, to higher education. And it has given families permission in large numbers to think about the alternative. To question whether or not the same resources, the same time, can be deployed in a different way. And in many ways, that is what we have proven at Minerva. We've now graduated 4 classes worth of students. And we've demonstrated that our graduates, whether it be in pursuit of further study, in entrepreneurship, the jobs and careers that they pursue, are producing better than Ivy League results. But we've done that with a population of students that is 5 times more socioeconomically representative than the incoming class in the Ivy League. Put that in perspective, only 13% of students coming into Ivy League universities, 13%, come from households making less than $50,000 a year. At Minerva, it's 60%. The majority of students in Ivy League universities are born into families that have a net worth of well over $1 million. And the outcomes of our students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds is significantly better than those that are almost guaranteed because of their parental lineage at Ivy League institutions. Now, why is that? How is it that an education, that a classroom experience can have that kind of impact? Well, it is because of a core combination of innovative pedagogical techniques that are used to ensure that students retain what they learn, a curriculum that is structured in such a way that students can apply what it is that they're learning over and over and over again across different contexts, but perhaps most importantly, because of a learning environment that enables feedback to the students and enables a learning journey that centers education on what a student can do with what they have learned, as opposed to certifying that at a moment of time they can recall a piece of information. The fundamental difference between a Minerva education and every education that you know of today, at least in the higher education incumbent space, is that the higher education world believes that learning is linear. You have an A- or a B+, you get a 93 or an 82. You have competency, you don't have competency. You have depth of knowledge, you don't have depth of knowledge. You have somewhat depth of knowledge, or a little bit. But the reality is that learning isn't linear. Real knowledge, real education, is about what you can do with information. It isn't about how deep can you remember or understand a concept. It is once you understand something, how do you use it? How do you deploy it? And across how many contexts and how many dimensions of application can you deploy it? And so imagine this scenario. And ask yourselves, can higher education display this type of information? Imagine two students, one of whom has a pick your scale, an A minus, a 92, a competency rubric mastery level of a 7 out of a 7-point scale. And another one that has an accumulated average that is somewhat lower. Instead of an A minus, they have a B plus. Instead of a 92, they have an 89. Instead of a 7, they have a 6.7. All of you would imagine, I would guess, that the student that's displaying the higher score is better. That is, after all, what we do. We look at a GPA, we look at a grade in class, we look at an exam result. We say higher is better. But now imagine that A minus student, the 92 student, has been able to demonstrate that level of knowledge or even application in 3 of, let's say, 60 different kinds of contexts. Whereas the 89 average student has been able to demonstrate that application in 48 of the 60. Is there any question as to who the better learner is? Is there any question as to who the person who is ready to actually deploy what they've learned in the real world is? Is there any question as to who will be better at any task that you give them? Yet that view, that institutional focus on ensuring that students can flexibly apply what they've learned doesn't exist in the world of higher education. And so, we have a choice as a sector. We can continue down the path of deteriorating standards, of a linear view of a learner, of continuing to detach what we expect society to fund us to do from what society actually needs. Or we can reform what education is all about and fundamentally reshape the learning enterprise so it is connected to what the world needs, so it is related to the future success of students, and perhaps more importantly, so that we are once again an engine to ensure societal prosperity and stability, rather than having the kinds of problems we all have to deal with today. Thank you for that. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.